Yeah, now.
Yeah.
Okay. Wait for her to
Teddy Lowe.
hear you.
Too.
Hey, good to see you. So what did the state government?
No, I'm at UH now.
UH, awesome.
Yeah. So I gotta stop by and say hi.
You're welcome. Hey, quick note for those of you in the in-person audience here, want to ask a question during the Q&A. See the black box in front of you. Push on the button on the right. The red light goes on to speak, and then push it again to turn it off. Thank you. From Honolulu, East-West Center, aloha. Welcome to this combined seminar webinar. This is part of the East-West Center Research Speaker Series, which is a recurring program to spotlight emerging developments across the region. Through this series, we explore the environmental, demographic, political, and economic processes that are reshaping the Asia-Pacific region. This event is being recorded. It'll be posted later on the East-West Center's YouTube channel and also on the East-West Center website's events page. Our topic today is collective responses to Chinese economic coercion. Our presenter is Professor Victor Cha. Professor Cha is Distinguished University Professor and Professor of Government at Georgetown University. He's also concurrently Senior Vice President and Korea Chair at the think tank CSIS in Washington, D.C. He was a senior official in the National Security Council in the George W. Bush administration. He's the author of 7 books, and this is his latest. It's a history of the two Koreas since their separation. It's easy to spot because there are not many best-selling books that have a hot pink cover, certainly in academia. And his proudest accomplishment might be that he appeared in a cameo role in the 2012 remake of the movie Red Dawn. Professor Cha will speak for about 40 minutes uninterrupted, after which we'll have a question and answer session. Those of you in the live audience know what to do. If you're viewing this seminar remotely, you look on your screen near the bottom of the screen, there's a button for a Q&A. You press on that button, a box will open up, you type your question in there and we will see it. We will get to as many questions as possible for Professor Cha to answer. Professor Cha.
Okay, let me just, for the benefit of the people online, let me just share my screen. I think that's working. I assume it's working. Okay. Well, first, thank you, my good friend Denny Roy, for that very kind introduction. I've always been a great admirer of Denny's work. Very fortunate for the East-West Center to have him here for all these years. He's, in my mind, one of the most respected China scholars out there. We had the great fortune of being able to publish one of his books in our series. I co-edited a series at Columbia University Press, and we were able to get one of Denny's books in our series. Very excited about that. I'm intimidated by this audience, not just because I see many familiar friends and faces, but I think I count 3 current and former presidents of the East-West Center here, which is not a lot of pressure, just a little pressure. But I know in particular that Susie is probably the busiest one out of all of us here. So I totally understand if you need to leave early from this. It's completely understandable on all of our parts. But before I begin, let me just say it really is a pleasure to be back at the East-West Center. I've been here before as a POSCO fellow. I consider myself an East-West Center alum. And to be in Hawaii, like Hawaii is my favorite place in the world. I was, as you know, I live in Washington, D.C., and our neighbors, my friends, are when my wife and we all get together, they say, oh, we're going to the Galapagos Islands, they're going to Paris, they're going this place and the other place. And the only place I want to go if I have free time is here, right? Just the only place I want to come is to our little place in Kakako and to be on the water. So it's really, people always say it's a pleasure to be here. It is genuinely a pleasure to be here for me. And I consider this place like my second home. So thank you very much for having me here. And again, I see lots of familiar faces. I mean, Charles was, he was president of East West Center when I was a Fulbright scholar, and I cold emailed him on the way back from Japan to see if I could just talk to him about my dissertation research, and he took out the time to see me. And then Richard and I have spent a lot of time together over drinks talking about China. And of course, Susie is just wonderful and such an important leader of this institution. So it's really a pleasure. And then Carlos and I go back to his time at HPU. So it's great to see him as well. So, really it's a pleasure to be here. As many of you know, and as Denny said, I work a lot on Korea. And this latest book, which just came out, is a book I co-authored with a professor in Europe, because we wanted to do sort of an American and European perspective on Korea's history since the late 19th century. Everybody said it was genius to time the book with the release of the movie Barbie because of the hot pink theme. Yes, the hot pink theme, which really, actually, for those of you who write books, booksellers, when they see that color cover, they put it on the front stand. I've seen it in San Francisco airport. I've kind of seen it all over the place. It's hard to miss. So it's something to remember for future books that we all write. But I'm not here today so much to talk about Korea. I'm here today to talk more about, I usually talk about Korea and security, and I'm talking about something different today. That's China and economics. And part of the way I got into this topic was that both when I was in government and outside of government, when we talked to allies and partners about joining the Mineral Security Partnership, joining the Quad, joining these other sorts of organizations, the response that one often got was, well, if a lot of hand-wringing and air sucking, and they're like, well, if we join that, China may not like it, right? And if China doesn't like it, they may squeeze us economically, right? And so you constantly hear this sort of response when it comes to any sort of issue, to the point where I felt like governments were actually starting to self-censor. Their behavior was being shaped by the threat of Chinese economic coercion. And so I became interested in this question largely from those interactions. And of course, as I'll talk about, the US government has come up with a strategy for dealing with this, but I think there are more things that we can do with regard to that. So let me use that as by way of introduction. The other thing is that often as academics, when we write articles and books, we sort of think of a problem, think of a theory or explanation for that problem, and then look for the data. This project happened very differently. It really grew out of the data. We did some investigation of data and found something interesting, and the argument sort of grew out of the data. So it's a little bit of a different approach than at least what I mean, economists, you may do this all the time, but I'm not an economist. And so for me, it was kind of interesting to do it this way. This talk is very well timed because an article version of this came out yesterday in the journal International Security out of MIT and Harvard. And then an earlier version of it came out in December in Foreign Affairs. But I'm still continuing to give the talk in places like this because I'm now writing the book version of this. And so I'm always welcome to all sorts of comments and criticisms. So let me start by, okay. Let me start with this slide. Here on the island, as well as in Washington, D.C., there's a lot of talk about 2027. What could happen with China in 2027? Lots of talk about a possible Chinese invasion to take Taiwan by 2027. There are people much more expert on this topic than I am, but if I were to hazard a guess, put a percentage on the chance that China would invade Taiwan unprovoked by 2027, I would probably personally, this may be blasphemous in Washington, D.C. to say, but I would put it at less than 30%, right? However, I think that by 2027, there is a 100% chance that China will use economic coercion against other states, as they have done in the past. So maybe less than 30% chance that China would actually invade Taiwan militarily, but a 100% chance that they will use economic coercion against companies and against countries. I define economic coercion as the use of non-market mechanisms to weaponize trade in order to exert influence on the political decisions of target states. And so I say here, while war is certainly bad, China's economic coercion is a pure competition challenge of the greatest magnitude. Because as I said, the threat of China's economic coercion is shaping the way states operate in the multilateral trading order, but it's also shaping the political decisions that they are making on Hong Kong, on Taiwan, on Xinjiang, on 5G, on all sorts of things, right? Because they're all concerned about being slapped by China, some sort of economic coercion by China. So China's economic coercion is a pure competition challenge that is not just a threat to the multilateral trading order and trust in the multilateral trading order, it's a threat to the liberal international order, right? Because it is affecting the way countries behave on issues ranging from human rights to democracy to security decisions. So as I will show in a minute, since about 2008, China's weaponization of trade has affected at least 18 countries and over 200 companies. So this started before Xi Jinping, but it has certainly heightened under Xi Jinping. And so this is just, so predatory liberalism is just another term used to describe this, but this is these next two slides are a list of examples of China's economic coercion against a wide range of countries: France, Japan, Norway, Estonia, the Philippines, Mongolia, South Korea, Palau, the National Basketball Association, which is not a country, by the way, but it's in there anyway, New Zealand, Sweden, Czech Republic, Canada, Australia, Germany, Sweden again, Lithuania, I think the one that has created the most consternation in the European Union, Walmart, Taiwan, Estonia, Latvia. And these are just the cases that we know of. These are just the cases that we know of. They are not necessarily all the cases. And it's only the cases that we know of because China's economic coercion is generally informal. It's unannounced. It is non-WTO conforming. There often is no legal basis for the action. And it is not economic coercion or sanctions in the sense that it's about some existing trade dispute or copyright dispute or intellectual property right dispute that China has with the country, right? This is economic coercion used to punish for something the target has done on Taiwan, or punish for hosting a visit by the Dalai Lama, or over a territorial dispute, these sorts of things. So it is not for economic purposes, it's purely for political purposes. So the number 18 targets and over 200 plus companies probably underestimates the number of cases of Chinese economic coercion, because there are many country targets out there that think or know they're being economically coerced, but they don't want to say anything because they don't want to draw attention. They feel if they do say something, they do tell the United States, they do say something that the pressure will ramp up, that there will be more pressure applied by the Chinese government. So we're probably underestimating the number, and these numbers come from our own data collection, but also they coincide with work that the Mercator Institute has done, as well as ASPI, the Australian Strategy Policy Institute, just did a report on Chinese economic coercion as well. Of course, China is not the only country that uses economic coercion. The United States has also used economic coercion. We use economic coercion against Russia. We use it against North Korea. We use it against Iran. But I would argue that that sort of, while it is economic coercion, it's financial sanctions, it's access to SWIFT, it's these sorts of things. I would argue that the majority of those are different from China's economic coercion. First, because they are formal and they're announced. Second, they are usually embedded in some sort of either domestic legislation or UN Security Council resolution, or something that there is some formal legal basis to it. And third, they usually have to do with punishment for some sort of behavior that is internationally unaccepted, right? So, such as invading another country, right? Or proliferating weapons of mass destruction, right? That's very different from sanctioning the NBA because the manager of one of the basketball teams on his personal Twitter account retweeted support for the democracy demonstrators in Hong Kong. And then China then stopped the streaming of all broadcasts of that basketball team's games in China, right? So you see sanctions against Russia for invading another country versus somebody retweeting on their personal Twitter account support for democracy in Hong Kong, then leading to hundreds of millions of dollars in damage to the NBA, right? So there's a qualitative difference there. So of course, the United States also uses financial tools as weapons as well. They weaponize interdependence as well, but I would say that that these are different in form, both in form and in substance. Okay, China's weaponization of trade. So I'm sorry, I should have done, so the sort of things that China does, I think you're all familiar with them. They will all of a sudden stop importing bananas from the Philippines because of a territorial dispute. They will stop exporting rare earth minerals to Japan over a territorial dispute. They will, or they have put sanctions targeting a South Korean company, Lotte, in China because South Korea accepted a U.S. missile defense system on its territory. So it's these sorts of actions that we're talking about. They are putting massive tariffs on Australian beef, barley, and wine because Australia has called for an independent investigation into the origins of COVID, right? So it's these sorts of things. This weaponization of trade is a source of power for China, undeniably. Given the size of the Chinese market, everybody is asymmetrically dependent on the Chinese market. Also, China operates in a dyadic format. So they, for countries, they want to shape the behavior of the countries. They focus on the bilateral relationship and they apply the pressure bilaterally for the purpose of gaining maximum leverage, right? And then third, it's a source of power for China because given the nature of the Chinese political system, there's very little domestic blowback, right? So if China decides they're not going to import Australian wine, or they're going to put huge taxes on Australian wine, there may be some Chinese that are upset, but it's not going to lead to any sort of disruption of the politics of the country just because of the nature, right? The nature of the political system in China. So size of the market, the fact that countries are all asymmetrically trade dependent, China's use of sort of bilateral, targeting bilaterally And then the fact that there's a little domestic pushback, this gives China a tremendous advantage when it comes to the weaponization of trade. In general, I think from China's perspective, this is working, right? It's working because countries and companies will change their policies. These are just some pictures. The NBA, for example, apologized, and the individual removed from his Twitter account the support for Hong Kong. In the case of the Gap, I don't remember the details of this case, but in the case of the Gap, there was something about a T-shirt that the Gap made that insinuated that Taiwan was, I think the T-shirt did not include Taiwan in the picture of China. And so the Gap immediately apologized and removed all the T-shirts and reprinted them with, you can see with Taiwan there. In the case of salmon, China stopped importing Norway from salmon when the Nobel Prize Committee awarded a Nobel Peace Prize to Liu Xiaobo, a Chinese author dissident. They replaced all of that with Scottish salmon, so it was a bumper crop year for Scottish salmon. But the Norwegians apologized, and it was either there was another case of, I think it was Sweden, hosted the Dalai Lama. They saw their bilateral trade with China drop like 60% in 1 year, and then they never hosted the Dalai Lama again. There was a study that was done by 2 European economists that saw a direct correlation between countries that host a visit by the Dalai Lama and a precipitous drop in bilateral trade with China in the following year, right? And all of those countries then no longer host visits by the Dalai Lama. So from China's perspective, this strategy is working, right? It is causing countries to change their behavior, and probably more importantly, it is causing countries to internalize China's preferences, right? Which is an even stronger form of power than forcing somebody to do something. When they start to internalize your preferences, that is what Stephen Luke's called the third face of power, right? The strongest form of power, where countries are now self-censoring. Companies and countries are self-censoring for fear of Chinese economic coercion. Okay, so how have we tried to deal with this? We, meaning the United States government and like-minded partners. The popular term of art is what's called de-risking, right? I think it was originally coined by Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, but Jake Sullivan has used it. President Biden has used it. And de-risking essentially means trying to blunt the impact of China's economic coercion and trying to prevent China from being able to coerce in certain areas. So one of the methods is what's called trade diversification, which is that, so for example, China put high tariffs on Australian beef, barley, and wine. And so what Australia, instead of taking the big hit from that, which was expected to be something like $16 billion, they trade diversified, right? They looked for other markets to export their stuff, that other markets that were willing to import. So trade diversification is one of the ways. Reshoring or friendshoring, this is the so-called supply chain resilience, where you try to basically move key elements of a production chain out of China into like-minded countries or partners that are more transparent and predictable, in order to protect that supply chain. So we see it with PPE in the aftermath of the pandemic, right? Personal protective equipment. We're seeing it most in the news now on semiconductors, right? Where there's this effort to protect the semiconductor supply chain. So reshoring, friendshoring, supply chain resilience. And then the third is impact mitigation. And what that generally refers to is efforts to try to blunt the impact of China's economic coercion of a particular country using things like increased market access, diverting foreign direct investment towards that country, things of this nature. We see this practiced. The most recent and high-profile case of this is with regard to Lithuania, where China, applied a lot of sanctions on Lithuania for having a Taiwan representative office. The US State Department and Commerce have tried to blunt the impact of China's economic coercion by diverting trade, by diverting investment, encouraging others to purchase Lithuanian products, these sorts of things. Not providing market access, because this administration is not about trade access right now. That's something we can talk about separately, but these three things, trade diversification, reshoring, and impact mitigation, are sort of part and parcel of this de-risking strategy that the administration is talking about. Just checking time here. So I think de-risking is fine, and I think we need to do de-risking. But de-risking measures insulate countries from China's economic coercion without stopping it. So if we protect a supply chain like personal protective equipment by moving production of masks and ventilators and other sorts of things out of China to Mexico, to Canada, to South Korea in order to protect the supply chain, that is very successful at protecting that supply chain. But it doesn't necessarily protect us against some other supply chain that China might go after. So as we've seen, as of August 1st, for example, China has put export controls on gallium and germanium, right? Two critical metals that are necessary for the production of everything from lasers to satellites to semiconductors, right? That was a supply chain that we didn't protect. And so the point of all this is de-risking is good and it's necessary, but it insulates China, insulates countries from China's economic coercion in certain supply chains, but it doesn't stop it, right? It doesn't stop China from finding another vulnerability that they would then want to use to leverage for the purpose of trying to coerce or influence political behavior. This is awfully small. I don't know what happened. This morning, this was 2 slides. I don't know how it ended up as 1 slide. So what I talk about this in this project is something called a strategy of collective resilience. And so for the academic audience, collective resilience draws on 2 literatures in international relations. One of them is literature on weaponization of interdependence, something that Henry Farrell and Abraham Newman have written a lot about. And the other literature it draws from is traditional deterrence theory in the security field. With regard to the weaponization of interdependence literature, this literature basically argues that actors who occupy key hubs in a network exert inordinate influence, right? That's that's part of what this argument is all about. But what I try to argue theoretically with this work is that while that is true, actors who occupy key hubs in a network exert inordinate influence, those outside of the hub can also exert influence if 2 conditions are met. 1, if they hold something of value to the hegemon, and 2, if exit options for the hegemon are limited. And then with regard to the security deterrence literature, I basically argue that not security, but collective economic deterrence is possible if actors have both the capabilities and the political will to support such a strategy. But if you look at the last 3 bullets, that's sort of the key point. What collective resilience is basically a peer competition strategy designed to stop Chinese economic bullying, to deter Chinese economic bullying. It operates on the notion that economic interdependence, even asymmetric economic dependence, right? We're all dependent on the Chinese market, right? We all export more to the Chinese market than we import from the Chinese market. Even asymmetric interdependence is a two-way street, right? The narrative is always, oh, we're so dependent on the Chinese market, we can't say or do anything, right? Because if we do, it's going to be financially very expensive for us, right? That is sort of the narrative that is deeply ingrained in everybody's mind when it comes to China. But the point here is that that is true, but even asymmetric economic interdependence is a two-way street, as I will attempt to illustrate. And the idea of collective resilience is basically the threat of collective retaliatory actions in the trade space with regard to China's high dependence goods could deter their weaponization of interdependence. Okay, that's all right. So, so when I talk about China's high dependence goods, what am I talking about? So this table here shows you. So as I said, there are 18 countries that have been targeted by China's economic sanctions, economic coercion. If you look at the trade data for these 18 countries, the composition of trade as reported in the UN Comtrade database, a publicly available database, there are 412 items that these countries, targets of Chinese economic coercion, that 412 items that they export to China, that China is more than 70% dependent on as a percentage of their total imports of that particular good, right? So we define Chinese high dependence items as any item in which China imports from another country where they get 70% or more of their supply of that good from that one country. 70% is a fairly arbitrary number, but it still is. But we think it's a significant number because if we take, for example, Chinese dependence on Australian iron ore, so many of you are familiar with the fact that China is very dependent on Australian imports of Australian iron ore. They will put sanctions or tariffs on Australian beef, barley, and wine, but they won't touch Australian iron ore because they're very dependent on it. That level of dependency is 58%, right? In 2021, it was 58%, right? And so here we're talking about 70% or higher, right? So of the 18 countries that China has coerced, they export 412 items on which China is more than 70% dependent, with a total trade value of about $46.7 billion. And then above 80%, it's 279 items. Above 90%, it's 169 items. This is a breakdown of the capabilities per country. So Japan by far has the most, 124 items that they export to China that are of high dependence. And then you can see the rest, the United States, Germany, South Korea, and others. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Palau are not listed here because they have no items that they export to China that China is more than 70% dependent on. So that's why they're not listed. Okay, so first, this was a discovery, at least for us in the data, that we didn't expect. We didn't expect that there would be this many items that we could consider China high dependence items that they import from the very countries that they have economically coerced. Right? So that's the point. The second is, okay, that's fine. You said that the total value of all this is $46.6 billion. China's total trade is what, like $12 trillion or something of that nature? Who cares about $46.6 billion? It's such a small fraction. But of course, it's not simply the total number of things that China is dependent on. The question is, what are they dependent on? Like, of these high dependence items, which of these things would really matter? And so we started combing the data and we started looking at what might matter for China. And we sort of came up with a list of things that range from goods that are important to China in terms of certain products they produce, both at home and abroad. To the other end of the spectrum, which is things that maybe not strategically important, but could be politically important, such as luxury goods, right? Luxury good items. So, so this is just a list of some of these things. I'll point out a couple of them. If you look kind of in the middle, Japan exports silver powder to China. And so the numbers next to them are the 6-digit HS codes that are in the UN Comtrade database. China is 90% dependent on the import of silver powder from Japan, right? And silver powder is used, it's an ingredient used for the production of solar panels, right? So that's kind of important. Again, the Philippines, almost 60% dependency on nickel ores and concentrate, which is used for electric vehicle batteries. You know, there are a number of these things, copper. We have a whole list of these things, but there are also other luxury good things like China is almost 100% dependent on the UK for its import of fine whiskey. Right? And they are 100% dependent on France for their import of fine brandy. So it's a range of things, everything from things that have to do with their electric vehicle battery market to solar panels to champagne, whiskeys, things of that nature. They are at the bottom of the screen here. They are literally 100% dependent on Canada for the import of frozen lobster, another luxury good. And they are almost over 70% dependent on the import of Kentucky bluegrass seed from the United States, which they use for their soccer fields, right? But there's a long list of these things. So of course, you know, China, if somehow one of these high dependence items they were not able to import them from one of these countries, couldn't they find alternatives, right? Couldn't they find alternative suppliers? Like anybody would want to be able to take advantage of the Chinese market, right? If the UK won't sell them whiskey anymore, maybe India or Japan will, right? These sorts of things. So what we also did was we looked at who were, you know, the top sort of exporter of this high dependence good to China. And then we looked at who were the second, third, and fourth exporters, all based again on reported publicly available UN Comtrade data. And so these were some of the examples of some of these, you know, so-called important products. Zinc powders. Grain sorghum is an important ingredient that China uses to make baijiu, right? They're really strong, like alcohol. And if we look at sort of the second and third suppliers, we then sort of comb the data to find high dependence good where the second and third suppliers are like-minded countries, right? Our partners of the United States, allies of the United States, are like-minded countries. So for example, Kentucky bluegrass seed, the next largest exporter of that is Denmark, 27%. So if you put the United States and Denmark together, that's almost 100% of China's import of Kentucky bluegrass seed. Silver powder, again, used for solar panels. The next after Japan, which is 90% of China's supply of this, it's the United States and South Korea. And as you can see, if you put those three together, that's almost 100% China's import of silver powder. The final way that we cut the data is we looked at, well, I only have 5 minutes left, so let me skip this slide. And I can talk about this later. Because this is so this is great. Like, so if we think about deterrence in terms of capabilities and will, there are capabilities there that people we think don't really know are there, right? And so that's it. The other part is political will, right? This is not going to work unless countries are willing to work together in an Article 5 type arrangement to say any Chinese economic bullying of one country would be considered economic bullying against all countries that were part of the coalition. And they would then take action or the threat of action to try to deter China from doing this. So political will to carry out a strategy of collective resilience is very important. There would be a lot of incentives to free ride. Countries would be, willing to say, yeah, I'll be a part of this, but I'm not going to do anything, right? I'm happy to be a part of it, but I'm really not going to do anything. It's not easy because in terms of domestic politics, why would Japan be willing to accept economic pain by cutting off the supply of solar powder to China when China is coercing Palau? Right? Like, why would they do that? Right. So the domestic politics of this is not easy. Private sector cooperation is not easy as well. Right. If Japan decides to stop exporting silver powder to China, that will basically mean every other company in the world that produces silver powder has a great opportunity to backfill what the Japanese have now stopped exporting. So there's no denying that there are lots of political obstacles to these strategies, and that they require a lot of political work to make it happen. But presumably, these 18 countries, all who have been economically coerced by China, do not want to be coerced again. And right now, if they're honest with themselves, we don't have a strategy to stop China from coercing. We have a strategy for trying to repair the damage that China has done every time it economically coerces, but we don't have a strategy to deter or stop future economic coercion. So if you want to live under the shadow of Chinese economic coercion for the rest of your life, then don't join the coalition, right? But if you want to have a fighting chance at trying to impose some sort of costs on China such that they will be deterred from considering willy-nilly economic coercion, then be a part of the coalition. Would China care? I can talk about this later. Okay, last point is that this is not a strategy advocating for a trade war, right? It's a deterrence strategy. Just like in the security field, when we talk about security deterrence, we're not talking about starting a war, right? We're talking about trying to maintain the peace by deterring the adversary by saying, don't try to start something, because if you do, the costs of your actions will not be worth the military action that you're contemplating. It's the same concept in economic deterrence. You're trying to send a signal. You're not trying to start a trade war. You're trying to send a signal that the costs of pursuing economic coercion for China will not be worth the action that they're taking against the target state. Second, this collective resilience strategy is not in lieu of supply chain resilience. It's not in place of de-risking. We need to de-risk, but we also need something in addition to de-risking that will try to stop future acts of economic coercion. I've given this talk in many places where people, globalists, and I consider my globalists, say this is like a nightmare. I mean, we're going to threaten trade wars in order to stop trade wars. With, just like we did during the Cold War, we threatened nuclear wars to stop nuclear wars. What's the world coming to? And I certainly am sympathetic to that argument. But we also have to understand that peer competition is not easy. Peer competition was not easy during the Cold War, and peer competition is not easy today. Sometimes it means certain policies that we're not used to pursuing that go against our instincts as supporters of the liberal international order, that go against our instincts. But it's been a few decades since the United States has had to deal with peer competition, right? Since the end of the Cold War, it's been a while. And so for many, this is a foreign idea, but it's part of what great power competition is about. So this strategy is not about destroying the multilateral trading order. It's about trying to preserve the multilateral trading order such that countries are not constantly living under fear of being economically threatened by China. So with that, I hope I stay on track, and thank you for listening. I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
We'll begin our question and answer segment now. And while the rest of you are thinking, let me jump in and ask Professor Shah on the issue of political will. The situation reminds me a little of a kidnapping scenario where families had a loved one kidnapped, and the police and the government pressured the family, say, don't pay the ransom, because if you pay the ransom, you're going to encourage more kidnappers. But their idea is, we just want our loved one back. You know?
Yeah.
So similarly, those domestic publics, when their government asks them, think of the big picture, you know, they may come back around again and get us or some other country. It's better if you suffer this pain for some other country. That seems to be a tough sell. I don't know if there's an easy answer.
No, I think that's right. I mean, that, you know, this is that, yes, naturally, when China uses economic coercion against another country, the first thing they want to do is they want it to stop. They want it to go away as quickly as possible, just like someone being kidnapped. You just want your loved one back. Like, you don't care about anything else. You just want your loved one back. But I will say that we have been seeing more and more conversations multilaterally among countries that recognize this trend in economic coercion and that are frankly getting pissed off and tired of it. For the European Union, Lithuania, the Chinese actions against Lithuania was in many ways a real wake-up call, where the EU started talking about deliberating on anti-coercion measures. The G7, for those of you who've read the G7 leader statement from Hiroshima, that was, to me, also a turning point, because you had G7 countries plus Australia, South Korea, Indonesia, and others, leaders that in writing are saying they need to organize to not just defend against economic coercion. Of course, they don't name China, but they're talking about China, to defend against economic coercion, but also to try to stop it, to deter it, which is defending against it is de-risking. That's what we're doing now. But they have now made at least the rhetorical step of saying we need to organize to try to stop it. And they even announced or established a coordination group for this purpose. NATO held their leaders meeting in Vilnius, right? In Lithuania, target of Chinese economic coercion. That was not by accident. Right? So NATO leaders also, NATO leaders plus the AP4, right? The Asia Pacific 4, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, which is now sort of a semi-permanent part of the NATO Leader Summit. They also made very forward statements about economic coercion. As you all know well, August 18th, the leaders of the US, Japan, and South Korea will meet at Camp David Trilateral Summit. I fully expect that they will make a statement about countering economic coercion. So I think there's been, while on the one hand, initially, countries that were targeted by China felt like they were targeted, they were alone, nobody could help them. They had no choice but to pay the ransom. But I think more and more countries realize, they look at what's happening, what people are doing for Lithuania, and I think increasingly countries are starting to see that they need to mobilize as a group to try to figure out some way of stopping this. And like I said, we see it in the European Union, we see it in the G7, we see it in the NATO plus AP4, we will see it in the US, Japan, Korea trilateral. So I think that's starting to change things. So.
Hello, everybody. Amanda Ellis. A question relating to any role that you think there might be for Moscow in this. I served on the Security Council with Lithuania, and their PR mentioned to me this growing cooperation between Russia and China behind the scenes. And I think we're all rather surprised at what happened with the illegal invasion of Ukraine and how China behaved. So just wondering if you have been analyzing the potential role Moscow may be playing with China in some of these activities.
Yeah. Thanks for the question. So my guess is that Russia would not be supportive of a strategy like this, because they would probably see the United States as the worst offender in terms of acts of Chinese economic coercion. But as I stated, I think what we do in terms of economic coercion is very different from what the Chinese are doing. I think broadly speaking, we are seeing a cohering of the Russia, China, North Korea, Iran axis. Completely separate topic, but we have some work ongoing now where we think there is significant ICBM cooperation between Russia and North Korea that explains the recent successes of their missile tests. So, and I think, as you said, Russian and Chinese collusion on the UN Security Council, I think has really impacted the ability of the UN Security Council to act, which is why we're seeing statements coming out of groups like the G7 and NATO that are much broader in scope, right? They're much broader in scope about issues that are not necessarily related to European security or not necessarily related to advanced industrialized democracies' economic agenda, right? They're talking about things that go far beyond that. And I think it's because there is slowly a move, because of the inability of the UN Security Council to do anything because of China and Russia veto, increasingly moving to the G7 grouping and the NATO plus AP4 grouping as the new sort of global governance institutions. G20 is too big and China's in it. But I think that's why we're seeing much more activity around G7 and around NATO.
Question from online. What are the typical issues over which China exerts economic coercion, and where do the Chinese draw the line? How can the recent tensions between China and South Korea lead to new economic coercion measures from China? Two questions in one.
So I think the issues are, at least empirically, when I look at them, the issues are pretty clear. They have anything to do with Chinese core interests. So anything to do with Taiwan, anything to do with Hong Kong, anything to do with Xinjiang, anything to do with a territorial dispute. These are kind of the big ones, right? This strategy, like if we have a trade dispute with China over protection of IPR, that is not something that we use collective resilience for. That is something we go to the WTO, right? That's adjudicated in the WTO. That's not what we're talking about here. These are specific actions that China uses on these issues: Taiwan, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, Tibet, human rights, territorial disputes. And for that reason, they can't be taken. You can't take that to the WTO, right? So it's a different type of economic dispute. So those are the things that I think that they often coerce, countries and companies over.
The Australia case was kind of interesting in that it went beyond a territorial dispute. It was an issue that might be embarrassing to China, basically.
Yeah.
Examining the origins of COVID.
Yeah.
So that's a little disconcerting in that it seems to be maybe going beyond just territorial issues.
Yep. No, that's true.
President Volsteck.
Yeah, my question, the coercion is taking two general categories now, right? We're not going to sell you stuff, or we're not going to buy stuff. I'm just wondering if you could talk a little more about the other part of deterrence is diversification on the global supply chain kind of dimensions. In the minerals field, there are a lot of mineral locations have been identified, but startup costs are very, very high. So it makes it probably tough for the private sector. But if you're looking at a diversification away from China of resources, there may be a consortium kind of government and private sector kind of possibilities in certain areas for certain minerals. That would be another way to counter this kind of difficulty, looking at long term.
Mhm.
And I'm just wondering if there's, when it comes to less costly things like moving assembly lines or various kinds of production things out of China. Again, there are educational costs and training costs and so forth. But I'm wondering if you're seeing at the same, in parallel with what you've been talking about, some cooperative activities in these areas that again mitigate the risk of coercion from either don't sell or don't buy from China.
Yeah, so we are seeing it in things like MSP, the Mineral Security Partnership, right, which is a grouping of countries that have come together to try to ensure, supply of key critical minerals. The book project is going to have a chapter on critical minerals. We've collected this. The data here is sort of on trade. We're also collecting data on critical minerals, right? Because again, that's another place where everybody thinks China dominates, right? They completely dominate, but there are also critical minerals that they are dependent on, right? That they import from other countries. So we're looking at that. Energy cooperation. I think there's going to be a lot more activity in this space. And it wouldn't surprise me if we heard more about it in Camp David in the summit that's coming up. In part because there's the restrictions on the export of petroleum-based products in the United States has been removed, right? I understand this is carbon-based and everything, but there's a strong argument to be made for the combination of increasing civil nuclear cooperation, as well as natural gas, LNG, to try to help secure the energy security of key allies so they're not dependent on Russia and the Middle East for these things. I think that's a very plausible argument. I mean, it's not entirely green, obviously, but I think the war in Europe has changed the way people look at everything, including the trade-off between green goals and maintaining some level of energy security.
Question from the online audience. Is China conducting economic intimidation against Vietnam? Should that be one of your cases?
It's a good question. I don't have data. I don't have data on Vietnam. It wasn't. So we looked at this pretty carefully of the reported, because we only have access to publicly available reports. The 18 countries were the 18 countries that we saw as being economically coerced, and Vietnam wasn't on that list. If you have information on Vietnam, happy to hear it and add it to the list. But I imagine that there is coercion. Like I said, there's a lot of coercion that's taking place. It's all unannounced. There's a lot of coercion that's taking place where the targets don't want to say anything, right? Because they don't want to escalate the situation by talking to the New York Times or there may be many other countries that we don't know of that are in this space. The U.S. government has said, based on the Lithuania case, the U.S. government has said, firms, governments out there, if you're being economically coerced, come to us, let us know. After giving this long sort of presentation on all they're doing for Lithuania. But the problem with the U.S. government explanation is they say, come and speak to us if you're being coerced. And so a country will come over and they'll be like, so we're being coerced. Can you give us the Lithuania package? We're being coerced. If we go public, can you give us the Lithuanian package? And the U.S. government response is, no, we can't give that to you. We have to look at the specifics. We'll do it on a case-by-case basis, right? Every case is different. Every case is not Lithuania. So for the country that's being coerced, that's deciding whether they come out or not, that's not very persuasive. right? That's not very persuasive. It's like, okay, I'm going to risk coming out now, but you can't promise me that you're going to be with me. That's not a very persuasive argument. So I think it's a problem in the way we talk about this. We talk about all the good things we're doing for Lithuania, and we tell people to come tell us, like, we've hosted meetings where the State Department says, we're open for business. Like, the US is open for business. Come talk to us about your coercion problems. And, we'll see what we can do. But we won't outright say you get the Lithuanian package, and we won't say we'll give you temporary preferential access to the US market, right? Not very persuasive, right? So.
Time for one more question. Yes, if you would.
Professor, thank you for this invaluable information, particularly for the East West Center. Proof of it is when you have 3 presidents of the East West Center show up, it's got to be very, very important. And which regards my question, and I know we can't meet with you as the Board of Governors afterwards because of Maui, and that's a very important reason why we are canceled, or it has been canceled. My question is, where do we go from here? Given what you've said, and you're at the right place to say it, what can we do at the center? What can we not do? What should we think about after you leave and go? What are some of the things? Is some of the important things that you said are too important to just say, oh, that was nice. You learned something, and then forget about what we can do action-wise.
Yeah,
That's
thank you. Thank you so much for the question. I should have started out by saying that like everybody else, my wife and I were shocked to see the news yesterday morning about what's happening in Maui. We spent a lot of time in Maui and Lahaina, and so it's horrible, and we hope for a speedy recovery and the return of the town and the return of the residents. I'm going to make contributions in any way that I can to try to help with the funds that are being designated for these people, these residents. So what can be done? I mean, one of the things I think, so there are 2 elements I think that matter outside of sort of the high policy perspective that we're talking about. One is legislation. So legislators have to legislate, right? If they buy that we need to stop Chinese economic coercion, they need to create legislation that do 2 things. That one, empower the executive to point out acts of economic coercion and empower them to act on it, right? So 2 months ago, before I came out here, I testified before Congress on these issues. And I testified before the House Rules Committee. In 28 years, I've testified, I don't know, over 20 times. I've never testified before the House Rules Committee. And that is because they are trying to create legislation that will empower the president, the White House, to designate certain acts as Chinese economic coercion that then trigger the ability for the executive, for the State Department, for the Commerce Department to do things in response to that. So legislation is very important, right? And then it's also multilateral legislation. So East West Center is a convener, right? You convene regularly groups of folks that come here from the United States and from Asia. So convening groups, even legislators, to talk about these issues so everybody knows how everybody else is addressing the issue of Chinese economic coercion and how they can create legislation. The second is the private sector, right? The private sector is very important because in the end, they're often the ones that will have to stop exporting silver powder or at least threaten to stop exporting silver powder. And 5 years ago, it might be hard to imagine that there would be cooperation between government and private sector to do some of these things, just because industrial policy was something that we just didn't practice in the United States. But when we see what's happening with semiconductors and everything else, there is a lot more expectation of what companies should and should not do. So that's another area where board members of the East-West Center, where the East-West Center can convene companies that help to create expectations and understandings of things like not backfilling, right? If Japan stops exporting silver powder to China as a form because China's coercing, then there's not another company that's going to go, oh, I'm going to backfill that market, right? To create normative expectations where a company is like, will be called out for doing that, right? So legislators and companies, I think, are the two places where someplace like the board or the East-West Center could play a role in terms of acclimating people to a collective effort like this and setting both law and expectations about what they should and shouldn't do. So.
Unfortunately, we've reached our appointed closing time. We could have gone on for much longer, but I want to thank Professor Cha for that excellent presentation and very thoughtful answers. And also all of you, both the in-person audience and the online audience, for attending. If you like this event, come back for another one. We'll have another webinar on Wednesday, August 16th at 3 p.m. Hawaii Standard Time, where Dr. Chin Tran will be speaking on environmental governance in Vietnam, a citizen's perspective. Until then, hui ho.